welcome you to the 2021 Winter Franciscan Zoom Lectures, hosted by the Franciscan School of Theology. Our presenter tonight, Sister Margaret Carney, holds degrees from Duquesne University, the Franciscan Institute of St. Bonaventure University, and the Franciscan University of Rome. From 1999 to 2004, she was the director of the Franciscan Institute and then president of St. Bonaventure University for 12 years. During that time, she chaired the Association of Franciscan Colleges and Universities and the Association of Catholic Colleges, which recognized her work with the Monica K. Hellwig Award in 2017. She currently serves on the board of Duquesne University and the Commission for Mercy Higher Education, which is the sponsorship board for 17 Sisters of Mercy colleges. She's a member of the Sisters of St. Francis of the Newman Communities. Her latest work is a biography, Light of Assisi, the story of St. Clare, published by Franciscan Media. It was also in the Zoom link at the bottom of that link that was sent to you, so you can go and click on that to find it in April on either Amazon or at Franciscan Media, to be released around Easter. I welcome Sister Margaret.
Michelle, thank you very much. And I want to open by thanking Michelle and Sister Kathy Flood of the Franciscan School for their superb support, both in getting ready and this evening. So welcome to all of you. I'm very pleased and honored that you're taking the time out tonight to spend this hour with us. And I'm going to start by letting you know that my focus this evening is actually going to be on the second half of the life of St. Clare. Now, I'm making an assumption that most of you already know the basic story of St. Clare, but fear not, I will do a very quick overview of the first part of her life so as to spend a little bit more time on the second half. Why am I doing that? I'm doing that because we don't often take a moment to contemplate the fact that Clare survived St. Francis by 27 years, which means that for almost 3 decades, she had the solitary experience and responsibility of not just preserving a charism they shared, but continually adapting and responding to both the threats and the promise of Franciscan living well beyond the lifetime of St. Francis. And I think in that way, she not only demonstrated the depth of her fidelity, but by studying these later chapters of her life, we come to a really deep appreciation of the radical equality of charism of both Francis and Clare, of both the women and the men who were the early founders of the order. I've also selected a kind of different metaphor for framing my reflections, and it's the metaphor of doors opened and closed. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. I want to point out what kinds of symbols are normally shown as representing St. Clare. So if we go on to our next images, we see that Clare ordinarily, whether it's a painting or a statue or a fresco, Clare will be shown with new symbols. For example, she'll be shown with the Eucharistic monstrance, which she held up to frighten away soldiers who were attacking her monastery. She will be shown with a gospel book or the book of the rule. And every now and then she's also shown with a branch of palm, not because she was a martyr, which that's usually the martyr symbol, but because she began her Franciscan vocation on Palm Sunday evening. So I think we have some images of those, Sister Kathy, that we can pull up so that people can see that these were kind of the typical symbols of Clare. And I'm suggesting that we look at her through another set of symbols. And that would be that the symbol of the door. One of the things that I think we see as we go through the life of Clare is that doors opened and closed were a kind of continual part of her experience. We can think initially of the famous door that she left home from, the door of an enclosed monastery, which is heavily guarded and rarely opened, the doors that opened to welcome her in the very beginning of her conversion experience. But I also think perhaps that symbol, the Eucharist and the Gospels and the palm are all familiar to us, but maybe taking some time to think about Clare and doors relates a little bit to our own situation now of the pandemic and our experience of being closed behind doors, where we can't open to company, we can't open to our families, we can't go out of those doors, especially those of us in winter climates, in order to conduct our activities. And so this notion of open and closed doors, I think, is also a very present reality for so many of us. But at the same time, we discover doors that open, and this technology of Zoom presentation and gatherings is certainly one of those new doors that this pandemic has opened and has demonstrated to us how very much we can do. And we might have never been able to gather this kind of group had I come in person to FST, but this door of Zoom has opened this presentation to people all over the country, and in fact, from many other countries. And we're thrilled to have all of you. So I'm going to move on now and just do a very quick summary of the key events of Clare's early life, a short summary of her early life, if you will. So we're going to start with her childhood and adolescence, and simply to say that she was born at the end of the 12th century, around 1193 or 1194. And at that point, she belonged to a family that was one of the most wealthy and powerful noble families of Assisi. It was described as a family comprised of 7 knights, which meant it was a kind of corporation. The 7 knights, the 7 leading men, brought into that corporation their land, their military ability, their economic power, their wives, their children, their servants. It was a very, very affluent and impressive familial system that Clare was part of. However, that very power became, if you will, a problem for that family and many others like it, because as the merchant class of Assisi began to develop its own economic and political power, there was an uprising against the royalty of the town. And Clare and her family literally had to flee Assisi and take refuge in the neighboring town of Perugia. And while it was a neighbor, it was also considered an enemy. So this is a place where doors open in an enemy territory to receive these wealthy people, and their peers in Perugia took them in. And we'll see later in Clare's life that the relationships developed during that time become a part of her whole life story. After the passage of some years, the family was able to return to Assisi, and Assisi was very changed when they returned. There was a new agreement between the merchant class, the rising class, and the noble class. And their struggle had, while the tensions were not entirely eased, there had also been a war with Perugia. And we know that as people began to reflect on the kind of violence that was enveloping their lives, religiously conscientious people began to ask whether or not this was all there was. And chief among those was Francis, the son of Pietro Bernardone. So it wasn't long after the return of Clare and her family that she begins to recognize and understand the questions being raised by the preaching and the life and the rejection of the status quo, not of Francis alone, but also of other young men who little by little come to his side and become part of his brotherhood, his fraternity. One of those men came from her family. Her cousin Rufino left the family corporation and went over to the friars, an action that undoubtedly created shock and scandal and great dismay among the descendants of the O Ferraduccio household, which was the name of her clan. Clare, as she gets into the age of young womanhood, would now be expected to begin to plan for marriage, although the plan would be done by the parental generation. And indeed, a variety of suitors, of young men or older men, were being introduced to Clare in the hopes of forming a marriage bond. But Clare had begun to hear and admire the alternative vision and pathway that Francis was developing. And that pathway was appealing to her and helping to formulate within her mind and heart a recognition that she had always had a deep yearning for God, a deep compassion for the poor. But the Franciscan pathway that was being developed was giving her an opening that she felt could give form to what she was desiring. She began a series of secret meetings with Francis so as not to alarm her family. And we know that finally, between the two of them, her decision was confirmed that she would indeed depart her family in secret in the beginning and become a part of the early Franciscan fraternity, but also create a place and a means whereby other women who shared that inspiration might also join with her and begin a kind of parallel sisterhood or sorority alongside the fraternity of the men. We know that one of the dramatic tales of her departure from her home is that on the night of Palm Sunday in 1212, she had to depart through a door that was away from the center of the house, not guarded, but very strongly fortified. And she would later remember that she had no idea where she found the strength to remove the barriers of that door and to leave. She leaves the household and then she goes through another door, the gate of the Porto Moiano, that would lead her down into the woods to St. Mary of the Angels. And we know that that gate in ancient times was dedicated to the Roman god Janus, who was a god placed over doorways as a sign of entering or closing off a part of one's life. He's the one that gave the name January, the beginning of the whole new year. So she begins to pass through a variety of doors. After the dramatic reception in which Francis cut her hair and clothed her as a penitent woman in very poor clothing, she was taken to a Benedictine monastery nearby, where their doors of hospitality opened to give her sanctuary during a period in which it was known that her family would try to forcibly remove her. They tried, they failed. And once it was clear that they would abandon that plan, Clare then moved to another smaller household of Christian women living out on the side of Mount Sabazio, women dedicated to living a prayerful life, a penitential life, and perhaps of also giving service to the poor and the sick. But finally, the door she longed for opened, and the bishop handed over to Francis and Clare the tiny monastery of San Damiano, where she would begin her work, now moving to the next chapter in her life of founding a Franciscan sisterhood and creating a shared life with the women who came to join her. So we move now to the next segment of her life, and that is her early years of working to establish this household of San Damiano and the gradual growth of women coming to join her. The very first being her own sister Catherine, whom Francis named Agnes in light of the suffering that Catherine went through to follow in Clare's footsteps. Gradually, numbers of women either joined Clare at San Damiano or created similar households of women following the Franciscan preaching and the Franciscan way in the various places where the friars were ministering and preaching. Already in those very early years, Clare could experience some of the dilemma of church authorities who were concerned about these new forms of religious women wanting to give a rule of life that would have them follow traditions of the older monastic communities. So from an early stage, Clare and her sisters had to be very thoughtful about articulating what was different in the way in which they wanted to live. In fact, Cardinal Ugolino, very powerful cardinal of the Roman Curia, was sent on embassy to these convents in central Italy. And even though he never completely was able to understand the inspiration of Francis and Clare, he was a real friend and help to them in these early years and began to set up that rapport between Francis, Clare, and the papacy and the leaders of the church in Rome. In later years, and through these early years, Francis and Clare clearly had multiple opportunities to share and to construct this pathway. But as time went on in the later years of Francis' life, he was less present to her and less present to the sisters of San Damiano. But finally, towards the end of his life, and following the suffering of receiving the stigmata, the wounds of Jesus, he came for a period of time to San Damiano and spent some weeks there in convalescence in a time when Clare could literally minister to him personally. And what is perhaps the most beautiful growth out of that period of time is that it was in that time that Francis worked on and composed his wonderful Canticle of Brother Sun, or Canticle of the Creatures. However, following his stay at San Damiano, the friars continued to try to find cures for his multiple illnesses without success. And he died on October 3rd, 1226. And at that point, the major shift begins to happen for Clare and her sisters. And what I would like to do is I would like to read just a sentence from the passage of the life of St. Francis written by Thomas of Celano that describes the really heartbreaking scene of the friars bringing the body of Francis to San Damiano so that Clare and her sisters can say their farewells to him. And the body is then taken back up to Assisi for the funeral rites and for his burial. Thomas of Celano concludes his description with these words: "Once he was taken away, the door that never again will suffer such pain was closed on them." Thomas clearly understood the drama and the defining nature of this change for Clare as she bids farewell to her beloved teacher, friend, companion, mentor, as she would say, her one consolation in this world after God. However, what becomes very clear is that if Clare understood that the first part of her life was creating a path of gospel living with Francis. The second part of her life would be making sure that that path was protected, well lit, and guarded for the many, many women and men that wanted to stay faithful to the original inspiration. She was helped in doing that. She was not left alone with this task. Elias, who succeeded Francis as the minister of the brothers, was a conscientious companion. Even before the death of Francis, he showed his concern and compassion for Clare and the sisters. And after Francis died, he was very clearly one who worked with her to help her preserve the right to follow Francis by being poor, that is, owning no property for worldly security. She also clearly knew not only Elias, but many of the other friar companions. We know that at her deathbed, the most intimate of Francis's friends, Leo, Angelo, Juniper, were there with her when she was dying. It wasn't an accident. This companionship continued through the years. They also continued as the Cardinal Ugolino became the Pope, Gregory IX, and continued to try to persuade Clare to sort of ease off her very strong and strict way of living. But at the same time, demonstrating an affection and an admiration for her over the years. And in that back and forth with the papacy, she clearly relied on the advice not only of the friars, but of new cardinal protectors who were assigned to work with her. And so Clare is beginning now to exercise a leadership of enormous proportion for the Franciscan movement. The next stage of her leadership is in the company of women. So we see Clare rising to a role among women. First of all, of course, the women of her own convent. Not only did women who had been inspired by Francis come from other parts of central Italy, her own family, her mother, Ortolana, her sister, Agnes, her sister, Beatrice, all ended up as her companions right there in San Damiano. The women of San Damiano, when we read their names, we realize many of these women came from the same families that were refugees of the uprising together in Perugia. In other words, they had shared life before they shared life in the Franciscan movement. The most famous of the women in her company was the great Agnes of Prong. She was the crown princess of the Premisil dynasty of Bohemia. She too had been implored to make a very powerful royal marriage. She finally gave up on that plan and renounced it, and with her enormous wealth created a monastery for friars, for the poor sisters, a church and a hospital right in Prague, and then entered that monastery, becoming its abbess herself. And in her correspondence with Clare, we see two women working hard to create a really new form of religious life, one that the church found it hard to accept and hard to trust. There were other kinds of women that Clare also might have known and probably influenced. Some of these women were lay women creating new forms of a pious or a religious experience. Often they were widows or women unmarried and who had been in the merchant or lower classes, and they formed households in the various cities of Europe with the intention of living lives of prayer and penance, but also of doing work among the poor and the sick. In Italy, they were called bizzocche. That word comes from the fact that they wore wooden sandals or clogs that gave rise to this name. In the Low Countries, in France and Germany, they were known as the Beguines. And when we look at the letters of Clare, not only are there letters to Agnes, but there's a document known as a letter to Ermentrude, who was a Beguine in what we would call modern day Belgium. Many feel that this letter is not authentic, that Clare did not write it, but I would challenge you to read the letter to Ermentrude and ask the question, even if Clare was not the author, is there anything in that letter that would be contrary to Clare's spirituality? And I think the answer to that question is no. Clare also most likely continued some rapport with women of other orders. The Benedictine order that first took her in, it was one of those nuns that had a vision while Clare was dying of the Blessed Mother coming to the bedside of Clare. So there was a spiritual rapport there with women beyond the confines of San Damiano. And so Clare in the company of women is taking a leading role. But she also had to move on to confront some really serious challenges. The first among those challenges was the fact that the friars, as time went on, were reluctant to be officially commissioned to take care of the monasteries of women. And there were many monasteries now, some of them called of the Order of San Damiano, who actually were not following Clare's rule, but following a rule created by Pope Gregory, who very cleverly used Clare's monastery's name as if to imply that all of these women were under the same umbrella. The friars were reluctant to be responsible for this burgeoning growth of different kinds of monasteries. And that may have created some tension for Clare at times, or at other times, perhaps she was able to support their concerns. But we would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to hear the conversations about that. There were newly founded monasteries that were determined to follow precisely a strict interpretation of her form of life, that is a life of poverty, of self-support by the sisters with the help of the friars. And clearly she and her sisters would assist those monasteries in their founding and formation. And sisters from San Damiano would go to those monasteries to be the leaders and the directors of education and formation. Especially Clare had to deal with the fact that the papacy, both in the time of Pope Gregory and his successors, continued to try to insist that it was too dangerous for women to live without financial security. And Clare had to never let down her guard as a variety of different papal initiatives tried to get her and tried to get Agnes to change their minds. And we'll say a bit more in a bit of detail about that in just a moment. And finally, Clare had to suffer, I think, what must have been a tremendous heartbreak, but one that is rarely commented on, and that is the fall of Brother Elias. While Elias had been her friend and helper, over time he ran afoul of first of the friars, who resented his campaigning for funds to build the Basilica of St. Francis. And ultimately he fell afoul of the papacy by siding with the emperor in the endless wars between empire and papacy. And the Pope saw to his being removed from the office of minister and even his excommunication. So we have to consider what torture that terrible event or series of events must have meant for Clare, and the evidence that Elias nevertheless continued to visit monasteries of sisters, perhaps as the last gasp of his connection to the Franciscans. We go then, what I'd like to do now is say just a little bit more and show you a bit of a chronology of these challenges that came to her as a result of the papacy trying to work with the Franciscan order as over time it confronted more and more problems. So we have a little timeline coming up now in the next slide, and it marks a number of particular events that would have impacted Clare's thinking and her awareness of what it was she would need to do. The very first event actually happened early, just 4 years after the death of Francis. The friars were having difficulty interpreting their rule. And so they went to the papacy. The Pope provided an interpretation, including the decision that the friars were not obliged to provide pastoral care to the sisters. That's when Clare went on her hunger strike and refused to eat until the Pope changed that and restored the right of the friars to be two brothers to her and her sisters. 12 years later, a new commentary was needed for the rule of St. Francis because there was so much confusion about how to live the strict vision of Francis. That commentary was created by 4 scholarly friars who did this work for their brothers. Just a few years later, the friars began to collect their eyewitness accounts of the life of Francis, which contained many reminders of how Francis warned the friars not to become lax, not to give up on the hard aspects of their life. It was during these years also that we have the famous incident of Clare chasing away the Saracen invaders. In 1245, the new Pope, Innocent IV, actually begins to give the friars the kinds of permissions, the kinds of documents that actually make it very easy for them through business agents to have money donated that they can then use for building projects, to purchase things they need, and to basically ease some of the tension of trying to live an extremely strict non-possession way of life. And in 1247, Clare is watching these new documents and these new permissions to the friars, a huge program of new building going on in all of their provinces. She's probably praying every day, what would Francis think? But what she was thinking was she needed to secure her legacy. She needed to submit her rule to a written document and finally to the approval of the Pope. And so we go now to the very last part of this drama, where Clare, probably beginning around this time of 1247, with her sisters who were probably just as anxious and worried about their future, especially a future beyond Clare's life, began to develop a rule that it was not a masterpiece of literary smoothness, but rather a kind of quilt where she takes segments of the documents of the papacy that created certain requirements for the sisters to remain enclosed in their monasteries, their habit, their times of fasting and silence. She preserves in that rule the very pure early inspiration of the form of life that was given to her by Francis himself. She also places in that rule a clear spirit that comes from the way the sisters live their lives. It's filled with statements that tell us that even though the regulations of traditional monastic life were stern and strict, she clothed those regulations in a feminine sensibility and graciousness and discretion. She had that rule approved by the cardinal protector of her order, and his approval had so much authority that it really was comparable to that of a papal document. But just a year later, Clare is breathing her last. She was dying. And Innocent IV, whose rule of life she and her sisters had rejected, came to pay respects to her on her deathbed. And in that visit, she asked him to put his papal signature on her document of rule so that it could never be gainsaid that what she and Francis desired and designed would last forever. And he took that document and affixed that signature, and it has been preserved to this day, giving her sisters for all time the opportunity to find their way back to her original inspiration. So I close now just with sharing my conviction that when we look at these last 3 decades of Clare's life, her stature grows and her ability to stand as a kind of lampstand, as Jesus says in the gospel, a lampstand giving light to all in the house of the Franciscan family, that it was her courage and constancy in these years that solidified and sharpened and gave us this splendid woman as our sister and our inspiration.
This lecture is brought to you at no cost. Free will offerings are welcome and accepted at fst.edu. Let's please all give her a round of applause.
Thank you.